The galaxy had always been afraid of humanity, even if no one wanted to admit it. For 400 years, the humans had spread across the stars like a wildfire that nobody could control, and the elder races of the Galactic Concord watched them with growing unease, because humans did something that no other species in known space had ever done. They adapted to everything. They settled on frozen worlds and turned them into gardens. They built cities inside asteroids and made them beautiful. They learned alien languages in months when other species took decades, and they bred fast and thought faster and never once stopped pushing forward. The Concord was an alliance of 12 dominant species that had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years, and they had seen many younger races rise and fall, but none of them had ever made the elder races nervous the way humans did, because humans were not content to be small, and they were not content to be told where they could and could not go. Could not go. So when the Velshari Dominion, the oldest and most powerful of the reptilian empires, proposed a secret agreement called the Purification Accord, many in the Concord Senate were horrified, but not enough of them were horrified enough to stop it. The Purification Accord was simple in its cruelty. 3 Concord species would launch a sudden and overwhelming military strike against Earth and every known human colony. And they would do it so fast and so completely that there would be no time for the humans to fight back or run or call for help. And that is exactly what they did. The attack came on a Tuesday by Earth's calendar, and it came from every direction at once, as massive war fleets dropped out of faster-than-light travel above every human world and opened fire without warning and without mercy. Earth was hit the hardest, because Earth was the heart and the symbol and the home, and the Velshari admiral who led the assault later said that the planet burned so bright it looked like a second sun for almost 3 hours. Colony after colony went dark, and the distress signals that managed to get out were short and broken and full of screaming, and then they stopped, and then there was silence. Within 6 standard weeks, every known human settlement had been reduced to ash and rubble and radiation, and the Galactic Concord issued a formal declaration that species number 4217, Homo sapiens, commonly known as humans, had been officially classified as extinct. There was a memorial held on the floor of the Concord Senate, and it lasted exactly 11 minutes, and 3 of the senators who had voted against the Purification Accord walked out before it was finished because they could not stomach the hypocrisy. The galaxy moved on remarkably fast, because the galaxy had always been good at forgetting things that made it uncomfortable, and within a year, humanity was already becoming a footnote in history. Textbooks. A cautionary tale about a species that expanded too quickly and made too many enemies. But the galaxy did not know the truth, and the truth was this: humanity had seen it coming. Not all of it, and not in time to stop it, but enough of it, and just barely in time to do something about it. Her name was Admiral Lyra Osei, and she was the head of Division Obsidian, which was humanity's most secret intelligence organization. So secret that most human governments did not even know it existed. And 3 weeks before the attack, her agents had intercepted fragments of communications between the Velshari military command that made her blood run cold. She did not have the full picture, but she had enough of it to understand that something terrible was coming. And she had enough authority to activate something that had been waiting in the dark for over 100 years. It was called Protocol Lazarus, and it had been designed by a woman named Dr. Kiera Fontenot almost a century earlier, back when humanity was young among the stars, and some people were already wise enough to wonder what would happen if the galaxy ever turned against them. Protocol Lazarus was not a weapon, and it was not a shield. It was a disappearing act. Across human space, in places that no official map had ever recorded, there were hidden things: sleeper ships buried inside dead moons, deep space stations drifting in the emptiness between stars, hollowed-out asteroids fitted with life support and engines, and underground bunkers on worlds that the Concorde had never bothered to survey. Admiral Osei sent the signal, and the signal woke everything up. The evacuation was unlike anything that had ever been attempted in galactic history. Not because of its scale, though the scale was staggering, but because of its secrecy. Because the entire point was that nobody could know it was happening. Millions of people were moved in the dead of night from their homes to ships and stations and bunkers that they had never known existed. And they were told only three things: that the end was coming, that there was a way out, and that the price of survival was silence. Not everyone could be saved, and that was the part that haunted Lyra Osei for the rest of her life. Because for every person who was pulled out of the light and into the dark, there were dozens who could not be reached in time. And there were the volunteers, the ones who chose to stay behind. On every colony world, skeleton crews of men and women who knew exactly what was coming volunteered to remain at their posts and keep the lights on and the communications running and the cities looking alive, so that when the enemy arrived, they would see what they expected to see: a populated world full of unsuspecting people. These volunteers knew they were going to die, and they stayed anyway, because they understood that every hour they bought their lives was another hour for someone else to reach the darkness and vanish. When the Velshari war fleet arrived above Earth and began its bombardment, it destroyed a world that was already half empty, though they never knew it. And when they burned the colonies, they burned shells, real enough to fool their censors, real enough to satisfy their admirals, but missing millions of the people who should have been inside them. The galaxy declared humanity extinct, and in a way, it was right. The humanity that had existed before, the humanity of open colonies and diplomatic missions and trade agreements and hopeful expansion, that humanity was dead. But in the darkness between the stars, in places no one had ever thought to look, something else was waking up. Something harder and colder and more patient than anything the galaxy had ever seen. Admiral Lyra Osei stood on the bridge of a station that had no name, orbiting a star that appeared on no chart, and she looked out at a fleet of ships that carried the last 800 million members of the human race, and she made a promise that she intended to keep. The galaxy had tried to kill her people, and it had failed, and now her people were going to become something that the galaxy could never kill again. They were going to become ghosts, and ghosts, as the galaxy would soon learn, are very difficult to get rid of. 5 years after the death of humanity, the galaxy was doing just fine. Or at least that's what everyone kept telling themselves. The Velshari Dominion had absorbed all of the former human territories and redrawn the trade routes to benefit their own merchants. And the Concorde Senate had passed 3 separate resolutions praising the new era of stability that had followed what they carefully called the human crisis, because nobody wanted to use the word genocide, even though that is exactly what it was. History books were being rewritten, and in the new versions, humanity had been a minor and somewhat troublesome species that had collapsed due to internal conflicts and poor planning. And the Velshari military action had been merely a peacekeeping intervention that arrived too late to save them. It was a comfortable lie, and the galaxy wrapped itself in it like a warm blanket. And then the ships started to disappear. Ignore. A Velshari military patrol of 7 warships entered the outer fringe, which was the dead zone where human space used to be, and they simply never came back. There was no distress signal, no debris field, no energy signature of weapons fire, no escape pods, no black box transmissions, nothing at all, as if 7 warships carrying over 4,000 crew members had simply stopped existing. The Velshari military classified it as a navigational accident and sent a search party. And the search party found absolutely nothing, not even a scrap of metal floating in the void. 3 months later, it happened again. A Krethali merchant convoy of 14 ships was crossing through the Orion Spur on a routine trading run when it vanished in the middle of the night cycle. and the last sensor reading from the convoy showed all 14 ships traveling in perfect formation at normal speed, and then the next sensor reading showed empty space where the ships had been. The Krethali were a proud and practical people, and they did not panic easily, but this shook them badly, because 14 ships do not simply vanish, and the Orion Spur was one of the most well-traveled routes in the galaxy. The Concord formed an investigation committee, and they put a mid-ranking Velshari diplomat named Ambassador Sayeth Voron in charge of it. Mostly because nobody important wanted the job, and Sayeth was known for being quiet and obedient and unlikely to cause trouble. But Sayeth Voron was not as simple as people believe, because he had been one of the few Velshari who had privately opposed the Purification Accord, and he carried a guilt inside him that he could never speak about, and he threw himself into the investigation with a dedication that surprised everyone, including himself. He began by mapping every disappearance on a galactic chart, and at first the pattern seemed random, but after 3 weeks of staring at the data, noticed something that made the scales on the back of his neck stand up. Every single disappearance had occurred along routes that were not on any current Concord star map. But when he dug into the old archives, he found that these routes matched exactly with humanity's most obscure and least documented trade paths. He brought this finding to the committee, and they told him it was a coincidence, and he did not believe them, but he kept his mouth shut for the time being. Meanwhile, a Concord science vessel called the Bright Horizon was sent to survey former human worlds and confirm that they were still dead and empty. And for 3 weeks, it did exactly that, sending back reports of burned cities and irradiated soil and silence. And then on the 22nd day, the Bright Horizon went quiet in the middle of a routine transmission, and the last 7 seconds of its final broadcast were nothing but static, followed by a sound that no analyst in the Concord could identify, a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The analysts played that 7-second recording over and over until it gave them nightmares, and one of them, a young Krethali woman, said that it sounded like something very large was breathing. Rumors began to spread through the darker corners of the galaxy, in the bars and back alleys and smuggler dens where information traveled faster than any official channel. And the rumor was always the same, whispered in a dozen different languages, but carrying the same meaning. The dead do not rest easy. Captain Torek Hall was a Krethali freighter captain who had been hauling cargo across the galaxy for 30 years, and he had seen enough strange things in the void to fill a book. But he had never been truly afraid until the day the Concord hired him to escort an investigative team into the Fringe. He did not want the job. In fact, he wanted to be as far from the Fringe as physically possible. But he owed money to people who did not accept excuses, and the Concord was paying extremely well, because nobody else would take the contract. So, Torek loaded his ship with supplies and investigators, and headed into the darkness. And every light year deeper they went, the more his instincts screamed at him to turn around. The investigative team found nothing unusual on any of the former human worlds, just the expected ruins and radiation and silence. But Torek noticed something that the scientists did not, because Torek was a spacer, and spacers learn to read the void the way farmers read the weather. He noticed that his sensors kept showing tiny ghost readings, little flickers at the very edge of detection that appeared for a fraction of a second and then vanished. And whenever he adjusted his sensors to get a better look, there was nothing there. He mentioned it to the lead investigator, who told him it was background radiation and sensor noise. Torek nodded and said nothing more. But he did not believe it for 1 second, because he had been flying through space for 3 decades, and he knew the difference between sensor noise and something that was actively trying not to be seen. When the Concord finally took the situation seriously enough to send a real military response, They sent a full battle fleet, 200 warships from 6 different species, the largest combined force assembled since the last Galactic War. The fleet swept through the entire outer fringe in a systematic grid pattern and scanned every planet and asteroid and dust cloud, and found absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. The admirals declared the mission a success and ordered the fleet to return home, and on the return journey, 3 ships at the rear of the formation vanished. It happened so quietly that nobody even noticed, until a routine head count revealed 3 gaps in the formation where ships should have been. That had been flying directly in front of the missing ships reported nothing unusual. No sensor readings, no sounds, no vibrations, nothing at all. 3 warships carrying over 1,000 crew members had been taken from the middle of an active military fleet, without anyone seeing or hearing or detecting a single thing. The Concorde classified the situation at its highest threat level, and emergency sessions were called in the Senate. And for the first time since the Purification Accord, fear was the dominant emotion on the Senate floor. Ambassador Scythe Voron stood before the assembled senators, with his map of disappearances projected behind him, and he asked a question that nobody wanted to answer. We mapped these disappearances against the old human trade routes, and they match perfectly. Every single one of them follows a path that humanity used, and that we never bothered to record on our own charts. He paused and looked around the chamber at hundreds of alien faces. The question is not what is taking our ships. The question is who. And I think every person in this room already knows the answer, even if they are too afraid to say it. The Senate chamber was silent, and in that silence, every species in the Concorde felt something they had not felt in a very long time. The cold and creeping suspicion that they had made a terrible mistake, and that the price for that mistake was only just beginning to come due. Somewhere in the darkness between the stars, something was watching them, and it was patient, and it was angry, and it knew exactly where they were. Deep inside the Erebus cluster, in a region of space so thick with nebulae and gravitational storms that no alien species had ever bothered to explore it, humanity was alive and thriving, and becoming something the galaxy had never seen before. The Erebus cluster was a nightmare for conventional navigation, dense clouds of charged gas that blinded sensors, pockets of twisted gravity that could crush a ship like a fist, and radiation storms that swept through without warning and fried any unshielded electronics. And that was exactly why Admiral Lyra Osei had chosen it. Because if it was hell for her people, it was impossible for everyone else. In the 5 years since the fall of Earth, the survivors had built a hidden civilization inside this cosmic wasteland, and what they had built was remarkable, not because of its size, but because of its purpose. There were stations carved into asteroids, and habitats hollowed out of dead moons, and fleet cities that drifted through the nebula like schools of great metal fish, and inside them lived approximately 840 million human beings, the last of their kind, the remnants of a species the galaxy believed it had killed. Admiral Osei, who was now called the Architect by everyone who served under her, had understood something from the very first day in the darkness, that the old way of being human was over and could never come back. There would be no more open colonies on green worlds under blue skies. No more diplomatic missions to the Concorde begging for recognition. No more trade agreements and cultural exchanges, and all the other hopeful foolishness that had made humanity an easy target. Instead, there would be something new, and she called it the Doctrine of Shadows, and it had 3 principles that every human learned before they learned anything else. The first principle was this: we are already dead, and the dead cannot be threatened. Principle was this: let them fear what they cannot see. The third principle was this: never conquer, never occupy, only remind them that the dark has teeth. It was a philosophy built on pain and rage and a cold, clear understanding of what the galaxy truly was. And it transformed everything about human civilization: their technology, their military, their culture, and their sense of who they were. The technological advances came faster than anyone had expected, and the reason was bitterly ironic, because for centuries the Concord had enforced intellectual property laws and trade regulations that had quietly but effectively throttled human innovation, preventing them from developing technologies that might threaten the elder races. And now that humanity was free from those chains, their scientists and engineers unleashed everything they had been holding back. The first breakthrough was the null signature drive, an engine system that produced zero detectable emissions of any kind. No heat, no radiation, no gravitational wake, no quantum disturbance, absolutely nothing. And a ship equipped with a null signature drive was invisible to every known sensor technology in the galaxy, because to those sensors, the ship simply did not exist. The second breakthrough was the Whisper Cannon, a weapon that did not fire projectiles or energy beams, but instead generated a targeted field that broke apart molecular bonds at a fundamental level. And anything caught in that field did not explode or burn or shatter, but simply came apart like sand in a wind, leaving no debris and no trace. The third breakthrough was the Echo Network, a communication system that sent signals through the quantum structure of subspace itself, completely undetectable by any technology the Concord possessed, and functionally instantaneous across any distance. And the fourth breakthrough was Lazarus Armor, a hull plating system that absorbed and redistributed all forms of energy, including visible light, which meant that a ship coated in Lazarus armor was not just invisible to sensors, but invisible to the naked eye as well. A hole in space shaped like a warship. These technologies did not come cheap, and the cost was measured not just in resources, but in the toll they took on the people who developed them. Scientists who worked until they collapsed, engineers who slept in their workshops, and test pilots who flew prototype ships into the nebula, knowing that any malfunction would mean death without rescue. But they did it anyway, because they had a reason that was stronger than fear or exhaustion, and that reason was the memory of Earth burning. The military application of these technologies was put in the hands of a woman named Commander Idris Wren, and she was exactly the kind of person you would want leading a ghost fleet if you were serious about haunting an entire galaxy. Black Operations Pilot, one of the best humanity had ever produced, and she had spent 15 years running missions that officially did not happen in places that were officially not dangerous. And she had a talent for making problems disappear quietly. The architect gave her 300 stealth warships and thousands of trained operatives, and a simple mission: go out into the galaxy and make them afraid. Wren's force was called the Revenants, and they were very good at their job. Every ship that had disappeared in the last 5 years, every Velshari patrol and Krethali convoy and Concord science vessel, had been taken by the Revenants, and the fact that not a single piece of evidence had been left behind was not luck but design, because the Revenants did not just attack ships, they erased them. But the disappearances were not random acts of revenge. They were precise and calculated, and each one served a specific purpose, because they carried military intelligence that humanity needed. And some were taken because their crews included high-ranking officers who could be interrogated. And some were taken simply to maintain the pattern of fear, because fear was a weapon, and Wren wielded it like a blade. There was one operation that became legend among the Revenants, though the galaxy would not learn about it for years. Wren's flagship, a stealth cruiser called the Absence, drifted silently alongside a Velshari dreadnought, in the middle of a busy shipping lane, close enough that Wren could have reached out and touched the alien hull. And the dreadnought's sensors showed nothing, because to its sensors, the Absence was not there. A boarding team crossed between the ships in vacuum suits that absorbed all light and radiation, and they entered the dreadnought through an airlock they had cracked without triggering a single alarm. and they moved through the ship like shadows, and utterly precise. They found the admiral in his quarters, and they sedated him and carried him out. And then they wiped every data log and sensor recording on the ship for the previous 12 hours. And they pumped a mild gas through the ventilation system that put the entire crew into a dreamless sleep. When the crew woke up 6 hours later, they found that their admiral was simply gone. His quarters were empty, his personal effects were untouched, and there was no record of anyone entering or leaving the ship. The Velshari searched that dreadnought from bow to stern and found nothing, and the admiral was never seen again, and the incident was classified at the highest level, because the Velshari military could not afford to admit that someone had walked onto one of their most powerful warships and stolen its commanding officer like a thief taking a wallet. Back in the Erebus cluster, a new generation of humans was growing up in the hidden civilization. These children had never seen real sunlight, or felt real wind, or walked on the surface of a real planet. They lived in rotating habitats, lit by artificial suns, and went to schools where history class ended with a lesson that every human child knew by heart. They tried to erase us, and we chose to become unerasable. There was art and music and literature in the darkness, and all of it was shot through with a fierce and burning pride, because these people had survived the worst thing that can happen to a species, and they had not just endured, but grown stronger. But not everyone agreed with the doctrine of shadows. A group called the Dawnbreakers argued loudly and passionately that humanity should stop hiding and strike back openly, that they should reveal themselves to the galaxy and burn the Velshari homeworld the way Earth had been burned, and that living in the dark was not surviving, but merely dying slowly. Their anger, because it was the same anger she carried in her own heart every single day, but she overruled them because she knew something they did not yet understand. Revenge was easy, but survival was hard, and she had not saved 800 million people just to throw them into a war they might not win. The shadows were not a prison, they were a weapon, and humanity was not hiding. Humanity was waiting. 8 years after the extinction of humanity, the galaxy was falling apart, and the thing that was tearing it apart was something no weapon could fight and no fleet could stop. It was fear. More than 2,000 ships had now vanished across Concord space, and the disappearances were no longer limited to the outer fringe or the old human trade routes, because ships were now vanishing in the core systems, in the busiest shipping lanes, in regions of space that had been considered perfectly safe for 1,000 years. The economic damage alone was staggering. Insurance companies refused to cover deep space shipping. Merchant fleets sat idle in port because their crews refused to fly, and entire trade routes that had been the lifeblood of galactic commerce were abandoned because no one was willing to risk traveling them. And the political damage was even worse, because the Concorde was fracturing along lines of blame and suspicion. Participated in the Purification Accord were pointing fingers at each other, while the species that had not been involved were furious at being dragged into a crisis they had never asked for. The Velshari Dominion, which had led the attack on humanity and had the most to answer for, was the most desperate and the most afraid, because the Velshari military had lost more ships than anyone else, and their admirals were starting to realize that whatever was out there was not striking randomly, but was specifically targeting them. So, the Velshari did what frightened empires have always done. They gathered their strength and sent it into the darkness to kill whatever was hiding there. The fleet they assembled was called the Obsidian Fang, and it was the most powerful military force the Velshari had ever put together. 500 of their most advanced warships, crewed by their most experienced officers, armed with weapons that could crack a planet open like an egg, led by Admiral Kesrath Vaughn, who was considered the finest military mind in the Dominion. Admiral Vaughn took his fleet into the Erebus cluster with absolute confidence, because he did not believe in ghosts, and he did not believe that a dead species could threaten the mightiest empire in the galaxy. And he intended to sweep every cubic meter of the cluster until he found whatever was hiding there and destroyed it. For 3 weeks, the Obsidian Fang searched and found nothing. They scanned every asteroid and nebula and gravitational pocket. They sent probes into every shadow and drones into every cloud of gas. And they found absolutely nothing unusual, just the expected cosmic debris and radiation and emptiness. Admiral Vaughn was beginning to suspect that the entire operation was a waste of time, when, on the 22nd day, every ship in his fleet received a transmission simultaneously on every communications frequency. It was a voice, a female human voice, speaking in perfect Velshari, calm and clear and carrying an authority that made even Vaughn sit up straight in his command chair. The voice said, "You are in our home, and you are not invited. Leave now, and you may leave alive." The bridge of Vaughn's flagship went absolutely silent, and every officer on every ship in the fleet felt something cold settle into their bones. Because that transmission had not come from any direction. It had appeared inside their communication systems, as if it had always been there. Admiral Vaughn was a proud warrior from a long line of proud warriors, and he had never retreated from anything in his life, and he was not about to start now. He ordered all weapons charged, and all shields raised, and all sensors pushed to maximum, and he broadcast a reply on every frequency. "This is Admiral Kesrath Vaughn of the Vilshari Dominion. Surrender immediately, or be destroyed." There was no reply. And then his ships started to move. It did not happen all at once, but in a cascade that was almost elegant in its precision. And the officers on the surviving ships watched their tactical displays with growing horror, as icons representing warships simply blinked out of existence, one by one at first, then in clusters of 2 and 3 and 5. There were no explosions, no weapons fire, no energy signatures, no debris. The ships just stopped being there, as if a hand had reached out of the darkness and plucked them away like pieces from a game board. Captains screamed orders into communications channels that went dead mid-sentence. Sensor operators stared at screens that showed empty space where battleships had been seconds before, and weapons officers fired into the void at targets they could not see and hit nothing at all. One crew reported seeing the ship beside them shimmer for just a fraction of a second, as if the light around it bent and twisted, and then the ship was gone, and in its place there was only stars. Another crew reported that their hull sensors detected something touching the outside of their vessel. Something large, pressing against the armor plating for exactly 2 seconds before withdrawing. And when they checked the external cameras, there was nothing visible. Nothing at all, just the black of space. In 11 minutes, 200 ships were gone. Admiral Vaughn stood on his bridge and watched his tactical display turn from a constellation of friendly icons to a field of blinking warnings and empty spaces. And for the first time in his military career, he felt genuine terror. Not the manageable fear of battle, but the deep primal terror of a creature that has realized it is prey. He ordered a full retreat, and the Obsidian Fang ran. They ran as fast as their engines could carry them, and they did not stop running until they had cleared the Erebus cluster by 100 light-years, and when they finally regrouped and counted their numbers, only 174 ships remained out of the 500 that had entered. 326 warships, carrying over 100,000 crew members, had been taken in less than an hour. And the most powerful fleet the Velshari had ever assembled had been broken like a toy. But the detail that haunted Admiral Vaughn more than anything else, more than the losses, more than the silence, more than the impossibility of what he had witnessed, was what he found on his command chair when he stood up after the retreat. It was a small object, no bigger than his fist, sitting on the seat where he had been sitting just minutes before. A hand-carved wooden chess piece, a king, lying on its side. Someone had placed it there while he was sitting in the chair, and he had not felt a thing. The Velshari released the battle data to the Concord Senate, and it caused an uproar that made every previous debate look like a polite disagreement over dinner. Species that have been allies for centuries turned on each other in the Senate chamber, shouting accusations and demands. And the Velshari delegation sat in stony silence because they knew that the data spoke for itself, and there was nothing they could say that would make it less terrifying. Ambassador Seyth Voron waited until the chaos had subsided before he stood and addressed the Senate. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the chamber. "We did not kill them," he said, and the chamber went silent. "We just made them angry. And now they have spent 8 years in the dark, becoming something we cannot fight. And they know where we are, and we do not know where they are. And every day that passes, more of our ships disappear, and we cannot stop it." He looked around the chamber at hundreds of faces that did not want to hear what he was about to say. "The only option left to us is to talk to them, because the alternative is to keep sending fleets into the darkness and watching them never come back." The Concord voted on an emergency resolution to open diplomatic contact with whatever was hiding in the Erebus cluster, and the Velshari opposed it violently because they were terrified of what negotiations would reveal about their role in the genocide. But they were outvoted, and they knew it. Seyth Voron was chosen as the envoy because he had been the one pushing for answers from the beginning, and because nobody else wanted to fly alone into a place that had just eaten 300 warships. He took a single unarmed diplomatic vessel and flew into the Erebus cluster, broadcasting peace signals on every frequency, and then he waited in silence and darkness for 6 days, while his imagination tortured him with every possible terrible outcome. On the 7th day, his sensors detected a ship, then lost it, then detected it again, and then the ship was inside his own shield perimeter, so close that he could see it through his viewport, except that he could not actually see it, because it was not reflecting any light. And the only reason he knew it was there was a shape in the stars where the stars were not. An airlock on his ship opened from the outside, an airlock he had not unlocked, and footsteps echoed through his corridor, and a woman stepped onto his bridge. She was human, and she was small, and she had dark eyes that held something between amusement and steel, and she smiled at him the way a predator smiles at something it has decided not to eat. "Ambassador," she said, "humanity accepts your request to talk, but understand this, we will be setting the terms." And Seyth Voron, who had spent 8 years wondering if humans were truly gone, looked at this woman and understood with perfect clarity that the galaxy had not killed humanity. It had only taught them to be terrifying. The negotiations took place on a human station called Requiem, which was hidden inside a hollowed-out asteroid in the deep heart of the Erebus cluster. And Ambassador Seyth Voron was the first alien in the history of the galaxy to set foot inside the hidden civilization that humanity had built in the dark. He had expected to find refugees, desperate, ragged, starving people clinging to survival in makeshift shelters, barely holding on after 8 years of hiding, because that was the story the galaxy told itself about what happened to species that lost their homeworld. What he found instead left him unable to speak for almost a full minute. Requiem was enormous, a city inside a rock, home to over 2 million people, and it was not a place of survival, but a place of purpose, with clean corridors and humming generators, and schools full of children, and workshops full of engineers, and laboratories full of scientists working on technologies that Seyth could not even begin to understand. The people he passed in the hallways were not broken or desperate. They were focused and sharp, and carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people who knew exactly who they were, and exactly what they were capable of. And when they looked at him, they did not look at him with hatred or rage, but with something far more unsettling, calm curiosity, as if he were an interesting specimen that had wandered into their home. Commander Idris Wren, the woman who had boarded his ship and who he now understood was the leader of the ghost fleet that had been terrorizing the galaxy, led him through the station to a conference room, where a tall woman with gray hair and steady eyes was waiting for him. This was Admiral Lyra Osei, the architect, the woman who had saved humanity from extinction and rebuilt it into something new, and she greeted Sayeth with a handshake and a cup of tea, and a politeness that was somehow more frightening than any threat could have been. "Thank you for coming, Ambassador," she said. "We have been watching your work on the investigation committee for years, and we know you were one of the few who opposed what was done to us. That is why you are still alive, and that is why we agreed to speak with you." Sayeth sat down across from her and tried to keep his hands from shaking, because he was beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened. Humanity had not merely survived, it had leaped forward technologically by what might be decades or even centuries, and it had done so while hidden in a place no one thought to look, and the galaxy had been dancing on a knife's edge without ever knowing it. The architect laid out humanity's terms, and she did so with the calm precision of someone who had been planning this moment for a very long time. The first term was full public acknowledgement by the Galactic Concord that the Purification Accord had been an act of genocide, not a peacekeeping intervention, not a tragic accident, but the deliberate and planned extermination of an entire species. The second term was permanent representation for humanity on the Concord Senate, not 1 seat, which was the standard for a new member species, but 3 seats, equal to the eldest founding races. The third term was the surrender of the 3 Velshari admirals who had planned and executed the attack on Earth, to stand trial in a human court for crimes against the species. The fourth term was unrestricted human expansion into unclaimed space, with no Concord oversight or interference of any kind. And the fifth term was a new treaty, a permanent agreement that any act of aggression against humanity by any Concord species would be met with proportional response from the shadows, and the galaxy would never again know where all of humanity was, and it would never be safe to assume that humans were not watching. Sayeth stared at the terms and felt the blood drain from his face, because by Concord standards, these demands were outrageous. No species had ever been granted 3 Senate seats. No species had ever dictated terms to the Concord, and the 5th term was essentially a permanent threat that could never be verified or countered. He said as much to the architect, and she nodded and smiled, and said, "You are correct, Ambassador. These terms are unprecedented, but so was the genocide that made them necessary. And I think you will find that the Concord's options are somewhat limited." And she was right, because when Sayeth brought the terms back to the Concord Senate, the debate was furious, but the mathematics were inescapable. Humanity had demonstrated technology that the Concord could not detect, could not counter, could not replicate, and could not defend against. And the Battle of the Erebus Cluster had proven that human forces could annihilate an entire fleet without being seen. And the 8 years of Disappearances had proven that human operatives could strike anywhere in the galaxy at any time. The Concord could refuse the terms and continue losing ships and crews and trade and stability, or it could accept the terms and gain peace and a powerful new member, and an end to the terror that had been eating the galaxy alive for years. The vote was not unanimous. The Velshari delegation walked out in protest, and 3 other species voted against, but the terms were accepted by a clear majority, and the Velshari government, desperate to avoid further retaliation, delivered their 3 admirals to human custody within a month. And then came Emergence Day. Humanity had chosen the date carefully. It was the anniversary of the fall of Earth, a day that every surviving human carried in their heart like a scar. And when the moment came, it was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. Across the entire span of known space, tens of thousands of human ships decloaked simultaneously, appearing out of nothing in the skies above every major Concord world. And for exactly 60 seconds, they hung there in orbit, visible, undeniable, impossible to ignore. On the bridge of every one of those ships, the crew stood at attention, and in the habitats and stations of the Erebus cluster, 800 million people stopped what they were doing and looked up, and there was a silence that stretched across light years. Then a message was broadcast on every frequency in every language the galaxy had ever spoken. We are humanity. We remember what was done. We have chosen mercy this time. Let this be remembered. And then 60 seconds after they had appeared, the ships vanished again, all of them, at once, leaving nothing behind but the memory of their presence and the knowledge that they could return at any moment. On dozens of worlds, beings who had been told that humans were primitive and short-lived and easily broken stood in the streets and stared at empty skies and tried to understand what they had just seen. And many of them were afraid, and some of them were awed, and a few of them, a very few, were ashamed. In the weeks and months that followed, the galaxy began to reshape itself around the new reality of a humanity that would not die. The architect, Admiral Lyra Osei, stepped down from her position and disappeared into quiet retirement on a hidden garden world that she refused to name. And her final order was not a military command or a political directive, but something simpler and more important. Build schools, build hospitals, build parks where children can see real stars. We have spent long enough in the dark. Commander Idris Ren was offered the position of Fleet Admiral, the highest military rank in the new human civilization, and she accepted it immediately. And then she classified her own location so thoroughly that even her own officers did not know where she slept, because old habits die hard, and Ren had no intention of ever being easy to find. Ambassador Sage Voron became the Concord's permanent liaison to humanity, and he dedicated the rest of his career to building the fragile bridge between a galaxy that had tried to commit genocide and a species that had chosen not to return the favor. And he wrote a memoir about his experiences that became the most read book in galactic history, titled simply, They Were Never Gone. Captain Torek Hall retired from freight hauling and opened a bar on a space station in neutral territory. And one evening, a human woman walked in and sat down at the counter and ordered a drink. And Torek stared at her because something about her was familiar in a way he could not place. The woman smiled and said, I was on the ship that took your convoy 8 years ago. I am sorry about that. Drinks are on me tonight. Torek looked at her for a long time, and then he laughed. Laugh. The first one in years. And he poured 2 drinks, and they sat together and talked until the station lights dimmed for the night cycle. And they became unlikely friends who met every week at the same bar to share stories about the void. The Dawnbreakers, the faction that had wanted open war and revenge, were quietly pardoned and welcomed back into the mainstream of human society, and their leader, a fierce woman named Kara Bright, admitted publicly that the architect had been right all along. Shadows were sharper than swords, and mercy was more terrifying than any weapon we could have built. And in a classroom on a Velshari border world, a small girl with green scales and wide golden eyes raised her hand and asked her teacher a question that had been bothering her all day. Teacher, why is everyone so afraid of the humans? The teacher paused and thought carefully about her answer, because this was not a simple question, and it deserved a real. Because, little one, the galaxy killed them, and they did not stay dead. There is nothing more frightening than an enemy you cannot kill, cannot find, and who has already decided to let you live. The girl thought about this with the serious concentration that only children can manage, and then she asked another question. Are they angry at us? The teacher looked out the window at a sky full of stars, any one of which might hold a ship she could not see, and she considered the question carefully. I do not think so, not anymore, but I think they want us to remember that they could be. The girl nodded as if this made perfect sense, and she went back to her studies. And outside the window, the stars burned on in silence, vast and cold and full of things that the galaxy was only beginning to understand. And somewhere out there, in the spaces between the light, humanity watched and waited and remembered something in the darkness that they would never forget. They had learned that the most powerful thing in the universe is not a weapon or a fleet or an empire. It is a people who refuse to disappear.